As you see here, the agenda, I will start now. The patriarchal body and introduction. One's body is one of the most personal, intimate, physical, but also social ideal parts of the human being. Everyone perceives his or her body differently, controls it, takes care of it, defines it. Physicality is an important component for everyone. Without it, we cannot move forward, act, express emotions. The body is a mirror of ourselves. At first glance, it seems logical to say that the body is self-determinant and that everyone has control over it. That this is unfortunately not so, the last millennia of patriarchal power have demonstrated too clearly. The body of every human being is often externally determined. This external determination begins with banal everyday processes, partnerships such as physical self-optimization, continues with people we hire, for example, as trainers or nutrition coaches, or to whom we are close to, such as family members. It ends up with physical determination by state power through laws, norms, values, and rules, and our body is externally controlled and dominated by it. Throughout history, there have been numerous examples of this external control. They can be found in all social spheres, from biology, medicine, sexuality, sports, nutrition, and so on, everything what you can find in your daily life. So all fields that we can adapt and optimize to improve ourselves and our lifestyle, which is determined by trends, fashions, and social norms, can be adapted and is determined by external factors. It quickly becomes clear that the body is anything but self-determined. We are physically determined by these external influences and dogmas. These rules and dogmas are mostly based on patriarchal culture that has permeated our society. Women have been defined and dominant by the ideas of men until today for thousands of years. In the natural sciences, there are some examples that show how little women are rulers of their own bodies. It starts with medical interventions, treatments that are not normed to the female body, but to the male. Continues with the development and administration of therapeutics and medication that are not aligned with the female cycle or hormonal balance or the reproductive apparatus, and potentially medical consequences for when are thus condoned and must recently happened with COVID vaccines. Physical interdeterminacy culminates in violent crimes committed by men against women's bodies, whether in private or public settings. The list of oppression mechanisms is endless. Underlying all these is a purely patriarchal social striving that has been permeated at all spheres of our world. With the emergence of feminism, attempts have since been made to break through this interpretive sovereignty and to break the male-made patterns. The focus has always been on the female body or the pursuit of legal equality, for example, right of body self-determination or abortion. The female body is thus the symbol of these efforts to regain power, and it also stands for the fact that the problem of patriarchy goes deeper than the supposed equality of the sexes would have us believe. In essence, it's about self-determination, equal participation, gender-neutral rights, duties, and promotions. In other words, existing boundaries of societies that need to be overturned or reinterpreted. The American philosopher, biologist, feminist Donna Jane Haraway, you see a photo of her here, published her essay, A Manifesto for Cyborgs, in 1985. In this essay, she criticized the conditions created by patriarchy and the resulting oppression of women and non-heteronormative social groups. The feminist movement that emerged from these grievances has been fighting this imposed injustice for years with success. At the same time, feminism in 1985 and also today faces internal structural problems that have now been claimed by the legal rights of hitherto marginalized groups, including people of color or women of color, LGBTQI community people, and women workers. Feminism has been the problem of not being able to fight for all women, but instead tries to reverse the situation with the Western capitalist and white agenda. In doing so, however, this did not reflect the real structures of society and faces legitimate demands of intersectionality and voice from people of color the LGBTQIA plus people, non-Western women, and working class women. Through the essay, Haraway thought to improve the situation for all groups of women, and she focused on the basic idea of the cyborg. Per se, a cyborg, as you can imagine, proposed in media, is a very patriarchal creature. The portrayal of Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator in 1984 alone has contributed to the stylization of the cyborg as a masculine ideal of strength, dominance, and omnipotence, which in turn lead back to oppression and exploitation mechanisms. At first glance, the cyborg does not appear to be the ideal figuration for the struggle for bodily self-determination and the claiming of rights by women and marginalized groups. However, upon a closer examination, Haraway's cyborg is exactly the right tool. Based on her expertise as a biologist, she begins to apply, but also to question the male-made rules of hierarchization, demarcation, and exclusion, and promptly redefines the cyborg as a non-human being. If one looks more closely, this conclusion is more than logical. A being, half biological organism, half machine, cannot be human by evolutionary definition, like we are acting with it today. Further thought, all social ontologies, legal systems, hierarchies, demarcations, and definitions conceived and projected onto humans are therefore invalid. Accordingly, women and men who identify themselves as belonging to the cyborg cannot be human beings. What was still considered a dream of the future in 1985 is today more real than ever. Body modifications, for example, implanted chips or cybernetic prosthesis or infrared antennas, like you can see here on the right side of Neil Harbison, who is the first cyborg or real cyborg in the world, have brought humans one step closer to becoming physical cyborgs. Biological and metaphysical boundaries are being broken down with time and technology, as well as social progress. This will inevitably be accompanied by a re-examination of existing rights, hierarchies, values, and norms, as it will be necessary to question how we as a community deal with this form of human technical life. Old principles, jurisdictions, hierarchies, and social codes will then reach their limits and will no longer be applicable. So at the core of this idea, and this is what I'm also going on in my dissertation, is the principle of dissolution of boundaries. In her work, Haraway has always discussed this topic. It also determines that through her subject of study, because both philosophy and biology are determined by demarcations and boundaries. Yeah, you have in philosophy, the field of ontology, and biology deals with taxonomies. Her work since A Manifesto for Cyborgs in 1985 have been concerned with the demarcations of the human society, whether in primatology by studying primates to demarcate them from humans, but also to transfer behaviors or values from humans to apes. And for a closer remarcation on this, please take a look in Primate Visions. About the more than scandalous debated oncomouse, I think I have a picture of that later, which is a scene real practice for breaking evolutionary boundaries and joins the contemporary simultaneous cloning debate about the sheep dolly in 1990s. Continuing with the Companion Species Manifesto in 2001, in which Haraway explores coexistence with domestical animals close to us and questions how far humans are willing to break down the boundaries with another being. All the way to her 2016 and more recent work, published book, Staying with the Trouble, in which Haraway questions the influence of humans in nature, and along with it, the drawing of human boundaries, and re-emphasizes for a responsible coexistence between humans, also which other animals and machines. Haraway is particularly critical of the value politics of patriarchy, which have led to damage to humans, especially women, other species, but also the environment physically and psychologically. More specifically, she looks not at the physical damage or bodily harm to women's bodies, but at the metaphysical level underlying these acts of violence and encroachment on women's bodies. The differentiation created and cultivated by man between genders, between species, between organisms and machines, nature and culture, and so on. You could write a long list of dualism which are made by patriarchal systems. On the one hand, based on scientifically evaluated facts, but they also reproduce a culture of science and determinism that envisions only the male as the dominant, the creative, and the powerful being. Through this performative application of patriarchal scientific culture, of course, no universally valid social theory and system can be derived. Haraway first pointed this out in her essay Situated Knowledge in 1988. Science and power structures based on purely male culture of science and the knowledge and interpretations that are produced within them require a comprehensive reinvention. In conjunction with the concept of diffraction of the US quantum physicist and feminist Karen Barat, it can be the previous practice of science, and these practice can be completely redefined and rebuilt. Knowledge and scientific facts are then created by processes that would correspond to a social universalism and would only be valid until they are replaced by new knowledge. Science, both humanities and STEM fields, and of course nature science and medicine, are confronted under this idea of a new practice. Far from scientific patriarchal dogmatism, outdated humanistic traditions or thought and inefficient practice, to achieve this, Haraway speaks of a reinvention of nature. This also based on considering the role of corporality in its abstract forms. In her work, she brings in, for example, a so-called boundary figurations, which make clear that a change must take place long ago in order to stop the control by the patriarchy. For your information, I will only present in talk 3 of these examples because it would take too much time. The concept of boundary figurations. Haraway works contain numerous examples of so-called boundary figures. They stand for beings that are able to question existing boundaries and demarcations, such as those of gender, evolution, social hierarchies, and so on, and ultimately call for transformation of the system. You can see here some examples in her different books. Of course, these beings themselves do not stand up and protest. Of course, the bacteria cannot stand up and protest, but their sole existence that they have confront the system and the participants in the systems with their own created fragility. They point out that the sequence or causal chains which have divided and given the world so far are finite and can lose their validity since they do not correspond to our withstand the self-imposed rules. The topic of corporality is not always directly addressed in Haraway's work, but is constantly present by means of topics such as illnesses, socially critical areas, such as prostitution or care work, or the addressed lawlessness and oppression that are clarified by the boundary figurations. I will now going to introduce 3 of these figurations, the cyborg, the oncomouse, and the string figures or cat scrabble. The cyborg. The cyborg stands for a monstrous being, which is on the one hand is supposed to deter, but at the same time is supposed to open up new possibilities of social reinformation. Just think at the example of the Terminator, and of course also as a tool of liberation, the cyborg itself. Within the manifesto, the cyborg also stands for the 3 spheres of new thinking. First, a new common coexistence of different species and the ability to become a new species like a cyborg. That has the power of redefine its own existence and future to be a complete self-determined being. I have to say that Haraway didn't write in her works how this should happen, how a human becomes a cyborg. She does not answer about that. I'm still figuring out with that. Second, an intersectional consideration and approach to solve the problems of marginalized groups in society, like women, people, and women of color, LGBTQIA plus community people, the working class, economically disadvantaged, and socially marginalized groups. So, for example, homeless people. The third aspect is improving and increasing the efficiency of technologies that can improve our environment and the way we live together in In relation to physicality, this idea can go so far that reproductive tasks are also taken over by machines. This topic was already controversially discussed by the emergence of in vitro fertilization in the 1970s by Shulamith Firestone and Gina Correa, and is still an important point of debate today regarding the self-determination and heteronomy of the female body. Conclusive, the cyborg stands for the reinvention of nature, far from patriarchal superior cultural definitions of the Western and capitalist world. So the second example, the oncomouse you see picture here, is an example from cancer research. It is an experimental animal that is created by humans. Regularly, laboratory mice are genetically crossed with human cancer DNA, and the aim of these experiments was to see how the human cancer cells behave in non-human hosts and whether the mouse body is more susceptible to tumors simply by implanting those genes. Through these experiments, which are all still common today, the oncomouse represents a frontier, frontier configuration that not only illustrates the human failure in science with respect to the ethical and human standards, it also shows that the evolution in species are fragile concepts. Similar to the cyborg, the oncomouse is an example of new species that is not quite mouse, but not quite human either. A redefinition of the boundaries is thus overdue. At the same time, the example of the oncomouse shows clearly what can happen when bodies become objects of the experimentation through patriarchal thinking about science and progress. The oncomouse became not only an experimental figure, it also lost its personal identity and value as a living organism by objectifying it as an economically patent. In this sense, an ideological connection can be drawn to the experimental field of the body, which also has to serve as an unconsidered experimental component in science, medicine, and daily life until today. My last example are the string figures or cat's cradle. These both terms mean the same. The string figures or cat's cradle are a children's game in which the aim is to form a string into patterns using your fingers and then to hand these over to a playing partner. The children's game illustrates well the concept of mutual responsibility in a shared coexistence. Every act has certain consequences which form like strings into a large web and thus result in a string figure or cat's cradle. The cat's cradle exemplifies the relationships and dependency of individual agents, for example, women and men, or human and animals, and so on. And these dependencies of the individual agents. Yet, the cat's cradle had also represented causal relationships effects on others. String figures are a charismatic physical metaphor to illustrate that humans have a responsibility not only to themselves, but also to their fellows, including humans, animal, machines, and organisms that are not immediately visible, but with which they are in indirect contact and actively interact. And you can imagine like bacteria or coral reefs or something like that, which we don't have in mind in that moment, but of course we are interacting with them by pollution or whatever. String figures tell life stories. These life stories are important because they represent the situation of each individual, but also show how they are interconnected. Up to which point we can react only and from which point we have to interact together. Accordingly, these string figures can also be seen as a metaphor for the female body and its interconnections in our everyday lives. Fears that have been marginalized or ignored so far, such as bodily self-determination, integrity, equal rights and duties, the right to act freely and to be heard, to be respected and treated equally. All these fears can find their way into our reality of life through the concept of string figures. The goal is that humans, animals, machines, and other agents respect each other accordingly and to take into account the standard in science. Yes, I go on to my conclusion now. So, industry, medicine, social welfare, private and public life, and politics. So all spheres of life for common coexistence and to redesign these structures sustainably in favor of consideration of all. So now my conclusion. In summary, while Haraway's idea does not directly address the female body, it does address the system that defines and discriminates it and seeks to reshape and thus reform it. Physicality is not only defined by ourselves in everyday life, but especially by the structures that are not immediately transparent. With ideas which seems abstract at first glance show that the problem lies deeper than the structures that define our everyday life. Especially the scientific, political, industrial, and social spheres are in urgent need of reform. Exposing these structures and transforming them is one of the most important steps to enable a common and responsible coexistence in the long run. Haraway's approach is meant to make us look deeper, to think along with those who seem important to us, but also with that has seemed as the other to us, and to co-create the world for all together. The respect and inclusion of the female body is the first important and more than overdue step to approach this reinvention of this world and nature and our nature. Thank you very much.